What Zelensky should have done early on was accept the Russian terms, accept the loss of the Donbass, accept the loss of Crimea, preserve his nation, preserve his sovereignty, etc. That didn't happen. The other thing was that, and by doing this, you understand, he locked Ukraine into a battle they could not win because the vast majority of the Ukrainian forces now became pinned down in the Donbass. You see, if had he withdrawn from the Donbass, he would have preserved 250,000 troops. Why do I say 250,000? Because that's the number of casualties Ukraine has actually suffered. We know this because there's been documents leaked by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, 191,000 casualties within the army, and then approximately 60,000 among the border guards, the Air Force, and other military units. 250,000 people, of whom around 70 to 80,000 are dead. This is solely because Zelensky made the decision to lock his military into an impossible situation in the Donbass. Ask the Ukrainian military today what's going on. They send battalions to the front lines. These battalions are prepared to fight the Russians. They arrive in the trenches. They spend the next couple of days getting blown away by Russian artillery until they lose 50, 60% of their forces, and they're withdrawn, having never seen a Russian. So the Ukrainians are getting butchered without ever having the opportunity to kill a Russian. This is all because of Zelensky trying to create the perception of capability where no such capability exists. And he needs to create this perception so he can continue to get arms and financing from the West. The Ukrainian military resents this. They resent the fact that they've been compelled to take some of their best trained units and use them in offensive operations just so Zelensky can say, I've launched a counterattack. We always get the headlines from the British media, the American media. The Ukrainians have counterattacked in Kherson. We never get the rest of the story. That within 12 hours of the counterattack, the entire force has been wiped out by Russian artillery and Russian air, that they've accomplished nothing other than being slaughtered. That's the truth. And the Ukrainian military is fed up with this.
Amnesty International pointed out that you've got well, actually, they sent a special team in, a bit like your weapons inspectors, to look at the positions of deployment of the Ukrainian army, noticing that hospitals and schools seem to be their favourite positions to have as their military bases. Now, some commentators have said, well, this is normal in battle. Amnesty have called the Ukrainians out, which I found quite surprising, really. Amnesty tends to, in military situations, actually lean a little bit pro-NATO, but this time they've stuck their neck out and they're saying that the Ukrainian army is actually deliberately endangering civilians here. Now, is it fair in military terms? Because these are the sorts of positions which the Russians will be much more reluctant to attack, Scott, aren't they?
Well, first of all, we know the Russians are reluctant to attack because the Russian Ministry of Defense on a daily basis releases a list of these targets saying that in this town, the school has been occupied by this unit, boom, boom, boom. And then the Russians do not attack that location. So, the Russians are calling the Ukrainians out on this and they aren't attacking it, especially when they know that the Ukrainians, because it's not just, here's the deal. If, let's say I'm defending the city of Albany, I'm allowed to defend the city of Albany. What I'm not allowed to do is hold the population of Albany hostage. I can't use them as human shield. So what any normal law-abiding nation would do is evacuate the civilian population of Albany and turn it into a fortress city. And in doing so, schools, hospitals, and all other formerly protected sites no longer have that protection because they're going to be turned into military defense locations. That's normal. When people say that's what happens in wartime, it's normal, they're right. As long as a building is not being used for its purposes, like a school isn't being used for a school or a hospital is not being used for a hospital, and instead you put military equipment there, it's a military target. It's fair game. What's happening here, though, is that the Ukrainians are, they're occupying buildings and they're keeping the civilians there as human shields. And this is what Amnesty is calling them out for. This is what the Washington Post called them out for earlier. And one of the reasons why they're doing this is that there's overwhelming evidence coming from the Ukrainian people themselves. You have mothers going up to the Ukrainians saying, get your tank out of here. You're near my home. My children live here. If you have your tank here, the Russians are going to attack you and you're going to endanger my family. This is happening over and over and over again. We talked about the casualties earlier. approximately 250,000 Ukrainian casualties. I would say that the Russians had probably suffered somewhere in the region of 50,000 casualties, dead and wounded. That's 300,000 joint casualties. Normally, in large-scale ground combat like this, it takes place in urban environment or heavily populated environment. You get a 1-to-1 casualty ratio between the civilians and the military. And here we have a situation where the Ukrainians are documented as using their own population as human shields. But here's the amazing fact. About 8,000 to 10,000 Ukrainian civilians have died. That's a lot. That's sad. But you know what? The civilian to military casualty ratio is historically low. Historically low. And when you have dead civilians, it's primarily because the Ukrainian army has used the civilians as human shields. The fact that this casualty level is so low is proof positive of the kind of campaign that the Russians are running. This is not the indiscriminate use of firepower that the West is talking about. This is the most disciplined application of combat power in modern history. Because, again, how can I say that? Look at the ratio dead civilians, dead combatants. It is historically low. Historically low. If the United States was running this campaign, based upon what we did to Mosul, what we did to Raqqa, what we've done to Fallujah, you could expect hundreds of thousands of dead civilians, because that's how we roll. The Russians are rolling differently. They're being very disciplined in their fire. That's one of the reasons why their rates of advance are so slow, because they're being assiduous. They know when the Ukrainians are dug in to civilian areas, and they're avoiding heavy combat in that area until which time the civilians are evacuated. When in reality, they would have every right to attack that place and kill civilians. International humanitarian law is quite clear that when a combatant power digs into a civilian facility, it loses protection. It loses protection. Therefore, let's say the Ukrainians dig into a hospital that's functioning. That hospital is no longer protected. The Russians have every legal right to attack it, but they're not. They're not. And I wish Amnesty International would tell the rest of the story. It's great that they call out the Ukrainians for what they're doing. But you know what? The Russians need to get full credit for how they're pursuing this conflict.